which I'm hoping that the panel will engage with each other as you note the forms of similarity and overlap between your areas. And please, in the audience, prepare your questions as well. We go for an hour and a half, and then there's a break. And I think at that point, our esteemed chair is presenting his new book.
Downstairs.
Chris Salter. Okay, thank you. So Patrick McCRAY is from UC Santa Barbara, and he will present something I'm very interested in personally, what we sometimes refer to informally as the art tech boom. That's a bit informal, I guess, but of the 1960s was characterized by, nowadays we regard it as a great precursor moment, inspiration and in many ways a source of modeling what can be done, especially in the area of partnership between art and engineering. But what I don't think I've seen anything really written about is the area that deals with commercializing the art and tech movement, how it would connect to economy and patents and intellectual property and all those sorts of things, I assume is part of this talk. So without further delay, here's Patrick.
All right, well, good morning. Désolé, je parle seulement un peu français, so I'll speak in English, so otherwise not to offend most of you. And thanks to Michael for the introduction. The talk that I have this morning is coming from a new research project for a book that I'm doing called Rewiring Art, and it explores some terrain that's familiar to all of you, groups like Experiments in Art and Technology and so forth. And related to this is a larger question about whether there are ways that histories of new media and art might be in conversation with the histories of technology and science. Now, media and art historians have, of course, given these 1960s era collaborative efforts a lot of attention. And although engineers and scientists were critical to these collaborations, the focus has largely been on the artists and the objects that were created by those artists. But because I'm a historian of science, what I'm more interested in doing is recovering the experience of the engineers and scientists who participated. So as an introduction to this, I thought maybe we could start by considering a person who was both an engineer as well as an artist. One of the people that I'm writing about in this project is a person by the name of Frank Molina, who had at least two different careers that overlapped and informed one another. So here we see him in September 1945 when he was a research professor at Caltech, shown posing with a rocket that he was instrumental in designing and building. Molina, however, would soon leave Caltech and indeed leave the United States to work for the United Nations in Paris, working for UNESCO. And shares of aerospace stock from a company that he had started during World War II, their value enhanced by the Cold War, made him very wealthy, and McCarthy-era harassment catalyzed his transition from engineer to artist. So if we jump ahead a decade, we now see him working in his Paris studio. Now, Molina had been a sketcher since boyhood. Making technical drawings, in fact, was one way that he financed his education, but he quickly tired of the traditional visual art that he saw in Paris galleries, and he began to experiment with electric lights and moving parts to produce electrokinetic paintings. And in 1958, he decided to patent some of the results from his experiments. One of those examples is shown here. Now, why did he do this? His earlier career, I would argue, as an engineer had primed him to the importance of protecting one's intellectual property and establishing priority. And he was also keen to differentiate his techniques from those of other artists. In fact, in the summer of 1959, he started a small company in Paris called Electrokinetic International, where he wanted to adopt his art-making system to produce displays for shop windows and airport terminals. And in fact, in the United States, General Electric, the giant company, even expressed interest in linking his visual displays to music as a new form of home entertainment that might compete with television. The effort didn't pan out, and Molina's company faded away by the 1960s, and he went on then to found the journal Leonardo, which I think all of you are familiar with. So I had long been aware, of course, of Molina's work as a rocket engineer, but I was very startled to discover his attempts to commercialize his aesthetic experiments. And this led me to wonder about how common this sort of practice was among artists and engineers. But maybe this really shouldn't be surprising. I mean, after all, why shouldn't artists patent their ideas? But the practice suggested that these activities could serve as a useful departure point to look at the hybrid practices that artists and engineers shared. For example, both communities have an interest in promoting and protecting their creativity and bringing those efforts to the market. So for the rest of my talk, I'll focus on two perhaps rather eccentric examples of ways in which this art-technology nexus was commercialized. But first, just one more background slide. As most of you know, one of the most prominent advocates of this alliance between artists and engineers during the long 1960s was engineer Billy Kluever, called by Life magazine as the Edison, Tesla, Steinmetz, Marconi, Leonardo da Vinci of the American avant-garde, which is quite a lot to live up to, but he tried. Kluever had gotten his PhD in electrical engineering from Berkeley in 1957, and then he joined the technical staff at Bell Labs, where he focused on laser research, and that point will become important, as you'll see in a minute. But Kluever also took advantage of his location in northern New Jersey to explore New York City's burgeoning avant-garde art scene. Of course, in September of 1966, he co-founded the nonprofit Experiments in Art and Technology, which was a complex organization with complex and sometimes contradictory goals. But at its heart, Kluever wanted to bridge the two cultures, that of art and technology, that had been identified just a few years earlier by C.P. Snow. Now, we can, of course, appreciate the larger context in which these artist-engineer collaborations that Kluever encouraged were taking place. The prosperity of American society, indeed Western society in the 1960s, afforded corporations the luxury to tolerate and perhaps even support these activities. But an obvious question that people asked Kluever and other advocates for these collaborations was, what was in it for industry? And here in a view graph that Kluever presented to a group of MIT folks in 1967, we get some sense of this. Now, some of the benefits are aspirational. Art collaborations could be a way, for example, of enhancing corporate prestige. But what's of special interest is the item highlighted here, something more tangible, what Kluever calls commercial fallout. In other words, bringing artists and engineers together might result in patents and intellectual property. It might stimulate new products and processes, and it might help American business. Now, another term from the 1960s also speaks to this commercialization process. The word is spin-off. First appearing in 1959 as big corporate entities gave rise to new smaller companies, the term was closely associated with the Apollo program and the space race. For example, the head of NASA during the Apollo program, James Webb, extolled the benefits of spin-offs that space exploration would generate for the American economy. So in the rest of my time, I'd like to look at two, as I said, eccentric examples of how these hopes for fallout and spin-off worked in practice. Now, both of these examples have a common origin. This was the EAT's construction of a multimedia art environment for the Pepsi company for the Expo 70 fair in Osaka. Now, for the Pavilion Building, Kluever and EAT had inherited an architectural design that they disliked, this crumpled, false geodesic dome made by a Japanese firm. Their response was to try to hide this with in order to sort of create a pavilion that could disappear. Now, of course, this wasn't possible. The next best alternative was to try to conceal it somehow. And the idea that was agreed upon was an artificial cloud or fog bank that would interact with light and create a larger sculptural effect. To realize this aesthetic, Kluever turned to Japanese artist Fujiko Nakaya, shown here. Now, Nakaya was the daughter of a Japanese physicist who was famous internationally for his research on the physics of snow and snow formation. Fujiko took her father's empirical approach to understanding meteorological phenomena and applied it to art. She wanted the fog to be generated using pure water, not chemicals or dry ice, and one way, of course, to do this was by spraying tiny droplets of water into the atmosphere. But the scale of the pavilion was beyond any existing systems, but in 1969, she learned of a scientist living in Pasadena who might be able to help her. This physicist's name was Thomas Mee, who had grown up in Louisiana, where he went to university, and he was especially interested in oceanography and atmospheric science. He spent some time in the 50s and 60s working for Cornell University on what can be described as weather modification projects. But in the 1960s, he took off for warmer climes and moved to Southern California, where he started a very small company that made instrumentation to study atmospheric pollution. Now, Mee, the physicist, had never heard of EAT, but he was impressed by artist Nakaya's knowledge of cloud physics, and he was, of course, familiar with her father's work. So he agreed to conduct some experiments with Nakaya on a method that could create large clouds of pure water fog. In 1969, the two of them set up equipment, for example, in his Pasadena backyard. Me had developed a system based on pumps that circulated water through a network of copper lines and nozzles under high pressure. At the tip of each nozzle was a tiny pin that broke up the water droplets and essentially created an ultrafine cloud, otherwise what we would call fog. And this prototype system worked well enough to create a giant cloud that obscured Me's house and alarmed his neighbors. Now, Me and Nakaya's system generated this pure white fog when it was installed in Osaka that poured down over the structure's irregularly angled and faceted roof and out over the fairground. A control system allowed Nakaya to influence its density, while wind and humidity varied the visual effect further. In fact, one could argue that Nakaya and Me's fog became the pavilion's most visually striking exterior feature. When he was interviewed in 1969 by art critic Barbara Rose, Me was asked if he had signed away his patent rights to Pepsi. Me brushed the concern aside, stating that, quote, all we did was sell a cloud, quote, to the software company. Me's collaboration with Nakaya and the success of the Osaka system, however, prompted him to think about ways to commercialize it. Contemporary considerations in line with the era's utopian and ecological leanings also drove his interest. And even before the Osaka Expo had opened, Me had filed for patent protection to cover his work. What he titled a, quote, environmental control method and apparatus, Me's patent cited the possibility of using his system for cooling agricultural areas, doing frost control, for example. But he also noted that the visible cloud that his system made might have a, quote, highly decorative and entertaining effect. Now, some years later, artist Nakaya also pursued protection for her intellectual property. In the late 1980s, working with a lawyer from Sony, she received a Japanese patent for a system that made, quote, a cloud sculpture from water fog. But their motivations were very different. Me was interested in more traditional use of patents, that is, protecting his commercial interests and furthering his business activities, where Nakaya, as she explained to me, wanted to create a record of her experimental techniques. As she told me, a patent offered a way to make her ephemeral work tangible by defining it in the precise language of law. So right there we have sort of two approaches to doing this, but two very different sets of motivations for pursuing some intellectual property protection. So moving on to my second example. In 1962, an industrial trade magazine asked in an advertisement, where does the laser go from here? Now, the first optical laser was demonstrated only in May of 1960, and even by the mid-1960s, these devices were still expensive and delicate laboratory-based devices that required experts to build and operate. But soon, one of the places where lasers would go were museums and galleries and art studio. And one of the people who moved with them was a physicist by the name of Elsa Garmeyer. Like Billy Kluever, Garmeyer's research specialty was laser physics. Originally trained at MIT with the Nobel Prize winner Charlie Towns, one of the co-inventors of the laser, she moved to Caltech in Pasadena in 1966. But she quickly found her career stymied by the school's treatment of women faculty, and she began to consider other options. In the summer of 1968, she approached Kluever about getting involved with some of EAT's West Coast activities. As she wrote in a newsletter for EAT, technological art is the first step toward eliminating this divinity of technological wonders. The technological artist approaches and utilizes the incomprehensible for his or her own ends in ways often irrelevant to the original purpose of the device. So initially, Garmeyer created lasergrams. These were photographs of images made by shining blue and red laser lights through various diffraction media and photographing the results. But she quickly began to also construct what we could call sort of light environments by, for example, in July of 1969, as Apollo astronauts were landing on the moon, she organized a cybernetic moon landing celebration on the Caltech campus. In addition to dance performances and other multimedia activities, she built a laser wall in which a low-power argon laser beam was spread out into lines of color that people could walk through. Now, I would imagine today you probably couldn't do that for various health and safety issues, but, you know, this was the 60s. So Garmeyer's blending of laser physics with art caught the attention of a Los Angeles-based filmmaker named Ivan Dreyer. Now, before moving into the film industry, Dreyer had worked as a docent, a guide, at the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, a famous local landmark. and he was a self-described astronomy freak. After seeing Garmire's presentation, Dreyer and another filmmaker visited her Caltech lab with the goal to film the colorful shapes and forms that Garmire's laser system generated. But Dreyer soon realized that filming laser images was aesthetically inferior to actually seeing them in person in real time. And they also imagined that the public might like to see lasers presented as an art form. In the fall of 1970, Dreyer arranged for a demonstration of Garmire's system at the Griffith Observatory, but the rather elderly, shall we say, observatory director wasn't interested in what he saw as entertainment and not edification or education. Undaunted, Dreyer and Garmire co-founded a company not long after that called Laser Images Incorporated. Building on the popularity of planetarium shows, they called their product Laserium. For the next few years, these entrepreneurs worked off and on to perfect their laser show and attract interest. And in June 1973, they received word that the Griffith Observatory had a new, younger, and more open-minded director, and they gave a demonstration there. And impressed, the observatory director gave them permission to run a series of shows. And in November 1973, after some well-placed appearances on morning talk shows in Los Angeles, some 700 people showed up one night at Griffith Observatory to see the public debut of Garmire and Dreyer's system. Classical and art rock music provided the soundtrack for the projection of multicolor laser images on the planetarium's starry background. Word of mouth expanded the audience, and soon hundreds of people nightly were being turned away for laser shows. Once established, Laserium was based around a standard system. The details of this are preserved in Dreyer's 1975 patent application, which describes, quote, a laser light image generator that would create a plurality of light images in different colors from a single laser. The basic format of each Laserium show was pre-programmed by the laserist, who could change the tempo and image sequences. Laserium shows, in other words, were performed live, and the quality of them depended on the inclination, the stimulation, the skill and imagination of the system operator. And by 1977, teams of laser performers had put on hundreds of shows in more than 15 cities, and Dreyer had trademarked the Laserium name. Now, just as planetarium shows had helped popularize astronomy in the 19th and early 20th century, Laserium was a public display of laser technology. Again, this was a technology at the time that was still relatively new. This was well before the era where you could go online and buy a laser pointer and bring it home and use it to amuse your cat. The roots of Laserium, in fact, we could trace back to the 19th century and displays of electricity and electrical effects for public audiences. And it was not without its aesthetic admirers. One art writer, for example, in the 1970s, referred to experiments with laser projection as, quote, these seeds of what will become the high, universally acclaimed visual art of the future. Now, given Laserium's penchant for attracting attendees whose appreciation of choreographed laser light was chemically enhanced, high visual art takes on a somewhat different meaning. Often lampooned as the preferred entertainment of potheads and LSD trippers, we can also see Laserium more seriously as the somewhat disreputable cousin of the venerable planetarium show. While maybe not quite the technical fallout that laser scientist Kluever had imagined, like Thomas Mee and artist Nakaya's Fog, Laserium was a commercially successful result from these fecund artist-engineer collaborations. But these examples have moved far afield from their origins. Moving to my conclusion. So at the start of my talk, I said I was interested in topics where histories of art and technology could be in dialogue with one another, and commercialization is one of those places. One way to align these art and technology historiographies is by considering reactions to these collaborations. As many of you know, they provoked a strong negative reaction from many art critics. As critic Max Kozloff noted in the heated language common to the era, artists had freeloaded, quote, at the trough of that techno-fascism that had inspired them. Others claimed artists' interest in Cold War technology was done in a social vacuum and with the flawed assumption that technology itself was neutral. The message here resembles the critical evaluations that historians have made of Cold War science. Put simply, that the Cold War had distorted the very nature of knowledge that researchers produced. Scientists and engineers, as historians have shown, often oriented their research to conform with the interests of their patrons. Similar debates have occurred over the patenting of university-based research during the same time period. Now, dismissive art critics certainly saw artist-engineer collaborations as impure. They argued the resulting art was aesthetically as well as ethically compromised. Now, we could perhaps argue that art is simply what artists do. There is, in other words, no natural path that art or technology or science must or should develop along. Perhaps we can salvage utility from this debate by taking a different approach. Instead of thinking about purity and distortion and so forth, maybe one can ask whether the history of a technique or a medium, computers, lasers, fog, video art, whatever, matters for how we think about the artistic ends to which it is put. Does the history of a technology, does its Cold War origins, does its corporate sponsorship that make it possible, does it change how we think about it as art? So to conclude, it's clear that artists, for example, here the artist Robert Whitman, shown with the engineer that he collaborated with for more than 3 decades, a man by the name of John Faulkner, it's clear that these artists entered these collaborations with engineers with open eyes. And industry, of course, did offer artists new and expanded opportunities. So I've given 2 brief, perhaps somewhat odd examples of where artists and engineers jointly engaged the marketplace. And there are dozens of other examples, dozens of other patents that arose from these interactions in the 1960s. As Andrew Nelson's recent work on electronic music at Stanford shows, these patents could prove quite profitable. But as I said, there's variability in motive. Maybe patents were a way to stake a claim. It could allow for aesthetic innovation to be recognized and stated verbally with precision and clarity. Patents gave artists and engineers a way to demonstrate that their ideas were new and original and their own. And in some cases, artists use patents to critique the commercial nature of the art world itself. So at times, this shared interest in invention, exclusion, ownership, originality, and recognition has united engineers and artists. In the 1980s and 1990s, even more commercially minded hybrid art technology collaborations emerged at places like the Media Lab, but that's another story. But seeds for these more recent innovation-directed art that we hear about so much these days can be found in the collaborations of the 1960s, where engineers were artists and artists were inventors. Thank you.
Please come in. The seats are to be self-served here. You have I'll take the liberty of the 30 seconds you saved. You're a little under in time, of pointing out something that we tend to have a visual and sonic disconnect in our community. People who know a lot about visual art tend not to know about the sonic arts. You mentioned Nelson's recent book on the sound of innovation at Stanford, which was, for those who don't know, the patents that Patrick were talking about weren't necessarily licensed and certainly didn't bring windfalls to the patentees. But the case of Stanford, in the case of Stanford's patenting of the FM algorithm, this was one of the most lucrative patents, and think Stanford, the king of IP transfer and development. And so this was a music patent that was a cash cow for Stanford. Now the interesting thing about the Nelson story is it unpacks that the inventor, whose name is John Chowning, would not ever have really done this if it hadn't been for his weak links or strong links, it doesn't matter, connections to Bell Labs. Because the Bell Labs computer music project, was his incubator before he even started the Stanford Center. And it was a Bell Labs research manager who heard the pre-disclosure of the patent and said, Chowning, patent that thing. It wouldn't have happened. And that's another little story in the for the archive of how Bell Labs was all over the map in that 60s and 70s period. So
the Stanford case is wonderful, and it maybe not germane to the discussion here, but it's one that I love to bring out whenever I'm in conversation with university administrators, et cetera, who are so focused on commercialization and IP and things like that. And they're always mentioning Silicon Valley and Stanford, blah blah blah, and it's always wonderful to point out to them that the biggest cash cow for Stanford was not coming out of computers, not coming out of biotech or whatever. It was coming out of music for several years. And they always sort of look really puzzled at this. And it
Also,
usually kills the conversation.
And fascinatingly, sorry, one more rejoinder, then we go on. It was also a corporation, Yamaha Corporation, which patiently for 8 years worked on the thing before it actually brought out a product. Anyway, that's a long story and all that. Great that we have a truly international panel, and as a Canadian, I'm always happy to introduce an Australian art technology or media art topic, because I feel like there's a Canada-Australia nexus, even if it's not always obvious. In this case, a profile covering more or less the same historical periods of Ostoja-Kotkowski. I hope I said that close to correct. And our speakers are both from Australian National University, Martyn Jolly and Tony Oates.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we're covering very much the same historical period, but in quite a different social context. Stanislaus Ostoja-Kotkowski was a Polish refugee who came to Australia in 1949. For about 3 decades, he was Australia's most prolific and wide-ranging technologically based artist. He produced abstract films, textiles and graphic designs, theatre sets, theatre lighting designs, outdoor projections, collaborative multimedia theatre productions, sculptures, paintings, murals and photographs. This paper concentrates on a few key moments in his career. But if you want to know more about him, you can go to these places here on the screen, either by buying the book or going online, and that'll fill in the background to his long career in Australia. Like many Australian artists, Ostoja drew inspiration from the environment of his adopted country. The sheer intensity of the light had a profound effect on him. He said, "The terrific iridescence that you get behind the eyes in Central Australia forces you to think of the source of light, be it beam, lantern or sun, and to think of it as the most impressive, most flexible and richest tool imaginable to an artist. It seemed to me that you could achieve this by using light as a tool, and that the closest thing to the source of light we know and can handle is electronics." He also pursued his work against an international horizon. He read overseas journals, contributed 2 articles and several reviews to Leonardo, and took several trips to overseas institutions. He had an assertive personality and a fixated self-belief in the ultimate importance of his own work, so he often wore out his welcome with other people. But nonetheless, his career was built on extensive collaboration. He worked consistently with theatre producers, technicians and performers. However, he also collaborated with scientists and electronic technicians from both industry and universities. And these collaborations were watersheds in his career and precipitated his most innovative work. And they are what we will discuss here. Importantly, Ostoja did not settle in either of Australia's 2 largest metropolitan cities, Sydney or Melbourne, but in the relatively provincial Adelaide. And Adelaide provided him with access to many key technologically advanced manufacturing industries and government research laboratories that were based in South Australia. Adelaide was also the home of the biannual Adelaide Festival, modelled on the Edinburgh Festival, which from 1960 supported Australian artists to mount productions which were expected to be at the forefront of international cultural development. Ostoja's first significant collaboration was with the Philips Electrical Industries Research Laboratory, which was based in Adelaide. From 1960, he'd been experimenting with the controls on a television set, adding extra contrast and pulling the picture out of alignment and synchronization. In 1962, the electronics engineer Angus Nicholson and Malcolm Kay from Philips assembled an external set of controls using test instruments from the Philips laboratory. And using this mechanism, Ostoja could control the electromagnetic fields around the tube of a television set to create highly distorted rasters that sometimes included traces of images from broadcast programs embedded in them. In later developments, the intersecting magnetic fields would pull the raster lines towards a point or draw them together into an abstract cascade. Ostoja photographed the results of the television screen and in 1964 exhibited them as electronic paintings. In the same year, kinescope sequences from the manipulated television were included in segments of a popular TV show and were shown at film festivals. And during '66, these images were featured on covers of the literary journal Meanjin. Although most conventional art critics condemned the works as being unemotional, in '65, Philips, the company, publicised the story's research in the in-house journal The Announcer, which was published in the Netherlands. In the article, the radical Australian writer and music promoter Adrian Rawlins enthused that the story's work was, quote, a new synthesis of art and technology which is perfectly in tune with today and tomorrow, almost like a Philips slogan. There is no doubt Astoria's experiments were internationally significant. Oscilloscope screens had been photographed in the 1950s, but Astoria, Kay and Nicholson are amongst the first in the world to work with television signals. At Philips, they produced abstract virtual images for transferal to film, while in the US, about the same time, artists like Nam June Paik were modifying entire television sets as physical sculptures. In 1967, Astoria travelled to 7 countries on a Churchill Fellowship. At Stanford University, he saw a demonstration of lasers, and for him, the intensity and purity of the laser red came close to the colour he experienced in Central Australia. He reported to Leonardo, quote, the blue-green is so brilliant that an aquamarine stone reflected in sunlight appears dull by comparison. On his return to South Australia, he began to work with the lasers of the Weapons Research Establishment. This was located in South Australia because of the Woomera long-range rocket test site, which is in the remote north of the state. As he reported to Leonardo, he split the beam of an argon ion laser into ruby red wavelength and a brilliant blue-green wavelength, and these beams were then diffracted through fractured and moulded glass chips onto a screen. Since 1960, Astoria had been regularly producing collaborative multimedia theatre events called Sound and Image. They combine the rear projection of colours slides with live action, dance and recorded music. In '68, he was commissioned by the Adelaide Festival to produce a sound and image event based on a Ray Bradbury science fiction story, The Veldt. The event included a computer-generated poem produced by the Adelaide University supercomputer. At the conclusion of the production, lasers diffracted by pieces of glass on a rotating disc were used to rear-project abstract colours accompanied by singing and electronic music. Perhaps the first time, maybe, that lasers were used in a theatre production. In 1970, Astoria was commissioned by the Adelaide Festival to produce an audio-kinetic outdoor sculpture called a Chromosome tower. 400 incandescent bulbs flashed in response to the frequency and volume of recorded music and sounds. And the following year, he received a Creative Arts Fellowship to the Research School of Physical and Earth Sciences at the Australian National University.
So the Creative Arts Fellowship at the Australian National University had been established in 1965 and sought to give creative artists the opportunity to work within an academic environment. While Australia's art establishment criticised Ostoja for his interest in science and technology, it was precisely this facet of his work that appealed to the university at that time. So at that time, the government had specifically funded the Australian National University to have a research-intensive focus. It considered itself forward-thinking, innovative, connected to the most advanced ideas, and like Ostoja, possessed of a worldview. Ostoja used his opportunity to extend his preoccupations with colour and sound and utilise technological resources that were otherwise outside of his reach, off limits realistically. Working with the university architect Derek Wrigley, Ostoja applied the principles of chromosonics, a correspondence of colour and sound using an electronic mode, to create an emblematic centrepiece for the Aquarius Festival of the University Arts in 1971. Much like the earlier Adelaide Festival Tower, this chromosonic tower stood 30 metres tall and consisted of 400 incandescent light globes mounted in coloured bands corresponding to frequencies from high to low. Erected alongside the festival bandstand, the tower transcribed, and I quote, the colour, rhythm, frequency and brightness of a selection of electronic compositions by contemporary composers such as Stockhausen and Cage, before being redirected to the live musical performances of each evening. Drawing on this tower as a model, Ostoja next envisaged a more complex design that incorporated lasers to produce, and I again quote, colour shape kinetics activated and operated electronically and mechanically using sound as a source of energy. With the expertise of the research school's faculties, technical staff, and electrical engineers, Ostoja began production of the laser chromosome. This is a draft, and in his draft proposal, Ostoja outlined the project as an electronic exhibit capable of translating sound and its volume into colour, shapes, and kinetics, mounted in a plastic sphere 32 inches in diameter. The front of the sphere will be treated as a rear projection screen, while the back will be clear, showing the works. The work consisted of red lasers, 3 of them, each producing a different image activated by a sound source. Backing this, 6 incandescent lamps, each coated a different colour, will be activated by the sound source. Central to the concept was a filter box designed by the research school's engineer Terry McGee. This split an incoming sound signal into frequency bands that drove incandescent lamps, lasers, rotating mirrors, and rotating moulded glass deflectors. In response to the selected frequency bands, the atmospheric washes of colour and pattern of the reflected lasers filled the space of the sphere. A second group of lasers were directed to mirrors, connected to a set of 3 loudspeaker drivers with their cones removed, which distorted the laser beam into a complex pattern, replicating the rhythms and cadences of the musical source. The work was built with a precise aesthetic in mind, its control panels designed to look specifically scientific, mechanical and practical. These were housed in the research laboratory's standard 19-inch rack mount boxes, and you can see that in the slide beneath there. This sat in stark contrast to the immaterial presence of the atmospheric aerethal projections that circulated within the sphere above, giving the laser chromosome a somewhat futuristic or robotic look. Ostoja's fellowship was extended into 1972, and this saw an overlap with that of Don Banks, a composer with a particular interest in electronic music. The 2 fellows collaborated on the production Synchronous 72, a Kunstwerk for the electronic age, which Banks described as, and I quote, a fluid situation where sound and image meet on equal terms and can influence one another. The title Synchronos, Together in Time, identifies the synesthetic premise of the performance and points to its utopian spirit of collaboration, where art was transformed into an immersive experience. The laser chromosome was the basis for a more complex chromosonic tower built for the Australia Festival 1975, which was also held in Canberra. Fusing the design of the laser chromosome with the scale of the earlier Aquarius and Adelaide Festival towers, the performative intent of the Synchronous 72, this work incorporated an array of optical equipment and light sources, a combination of blue, green and red lasers, effects processors and incandescent lamps, which were manipulated by performers who sat within the tower. The Laser Chromosome Tower 75 represented a large-scale collaboration between engineers and builders with components coming from many different companies and laboratories. Ostoja gifted one of his laser chromosomes to the university at the end of his fellowship. It was loaned to him on occasion for various performances, and from 1982 to 1988 it was on loan and displayed in a volunteer-run Canberra Science Museum called Questacon, much like the planetariums that you referred to before. Sometime after its return, and quite incredibly after making an endorsement of Ostoja's art, the university discarded the laser chromosome, its scientific appearance perhaps belying its artistic significance.
Okay. So in 1975, as well as building the laser chromosome tower, Ostoja-Kotkowski brought 2 pheromones to Canberra for the event Computers and Electronics in the Arts. The pheromones utilised geometrically sandblasted stainless steel interactive paintings as aerials. A composition called the Legions of Asmodeus, commissioned from the composer Larry Zitsky, was performed for 4 pheromones, Ostoja's pair and 2 on loan, in the presence of the Prime Minister of Australia, Gough Whitlam.
That's okay, it's gone.
Okay, cool. What happened after that event? That's Gough Whitlam on the left, Ostoja on the right, just so you don't get them confused. Our Prime Minister would never have a goatee beard. What happened after that event is unclear. After the festival, Ostoja may have gifted the pheromone directly to the ANU, or he may have gifted it to the Prime Minister, who passed it back to the ANU. This pheromone fared only slightly better than the laser chromosomes. In the early 2000s, the aerial, minus the electronic components, was found in a rubbish skip at the back of the School of Music by a colleague. This colleague was an artist originally from Adelaide as well, so he recognised the design as being the work of Ostoja. He was a well-trained art historian. The aerial was retrieved from the rubbish skip and formally accessioned into the ANU's art collection and hung in the corridor of the School of Art for several years. In 2013, the School of Art received a grant to restore the rescued Ferryman. Dr. Stephen Jones worked with the School of Art's Alistair Riddell and the electronics workshop of the Research School of Physics and Engineering. The original vintage aerial from 1975 had new electronics restored to it. In addition, 3 Ferrymans were replicated with the same circuitry and antenna made from large panels of sheet steel bought from a hardware shop with geometric patterns inspired by Ostoja's original sandblasting incised into them by the ANU School of Arts technical officer Frank McConchie. When the electronics technician Phil Storr had first built the Ferryman for Ostoja in the early 1970s, he modified a circuit designed by Leo Simpson that had appeared in Electronics Australia in 1969. However, Phil Storr's modified circuit diagrams were not available in 2013. So instead, Stephen Jones returned to the original circuit design from Electronics Australia and modified it to accommodate both the heavier steel plate used by Ostoja and the lighter steel of the replica Ferrymans. Jones substituted no longer available components and produced new printed circuit boards to make 4 sets of Ferryman electronic packs. Larry Zitsky still had the original score of the Legions of Asmodeus, which was transferred to a decibel score player app on 4 synchronized iPads. The score was a continuous line for each performer representing relative pitch, with markings for crescendo and decrescendo and volume. The piece was reperformed by the Charles Martyn Percussion Ensemble on October 2013 at an event titled Revenant Media. On the night, a member of the original Prime Minister's entourage returned and was given pride of place in the audience. Several issues were raised by this sequence of events. The first is that because electronic art does not necessarily look like conventional art, it is much more vulnerable to being destroyed or thrown out. Because it is necessarily interdisciplinary art, produced not in art galleries or art studios, but in engineering laboratories, it does not automatically enter conventional systems of curation, accessioning, and preservation. Was the remaining Ferryman, which was literally rescued from the dustbin of history, in the nick of time restored? The new Ferryman circuitry, which Dr. Jones built for it, although from the same source as the original, may have sounded slightly different. But this difference would have been so slight as to be indistinguishable in the performance. The restored original Ferryman used heavier gauge steel to the replica Ferrymans, and therefore had different capacitance, but they sounded indistinguishable when played. In any case, would this have mattered, when for Ostoja himself, what was primarily at issue was not the precise sonority of the instruments, but their performance and interactivity. In any case as well, the Ferryman was designed to be both a painting and an instrument. So instead of the conventional pitch control and volume control antenna set at right angles to each other, it had a large square surface as a pitch control antenna and no volume control. It was therefore very difficult for the musicians to control. They needed to develop a new technique using the volume knob and were able to play some markings in the score, weren't able to play some markings in the original score, such as reverb effects. But the score's musicality was not the prime issue for Ostoja either, or even perhaps for the composer. Perhaps the most significant change was in the idiom of the performance itself. From surviving photographs and records, the original performance had an improvisatory feel, with scruffy students experimenting on the instrument amidst a clutter of electronics. However, in the 2013 performance, the piece was performed in the formal idiom of the Classical Concert Music Hall. Dressed in black, the musicians stood beside their instruments and played them while the audience watched in appreciative silence. In contrast, the performances in the 1970s were characterised by their unpredictability, and often equipment didn't work as intended. However, now electronic music has been recuperated into the concert hall. So our experience so far with remembering, researching, restoring, and reenacting the work of Ostoja and the scientific collaborators has revealed the many issues of cultural value, personal recognition, and technical ephemerality that are at the stake in contemporary Australian media history. These issues become even more complicated when Australian media art history is seen in an international context. Thank you.
That's super, and despite the pauses for tech, you also have a little time, and I think, I'll just say, I'm very impressed, and I think it's really outstanding to see a new contribution to what would otherwise, I think, for many of us, be seen as a very well-covered terrain, the synesthetic, Gesamtkunstwerk, video, or laser, or other way of doing these sorts of audiovisual. And so I'm not aware of this having been covered in that otherwise very well-covered area. I'd personally be interested, although we don't touch on it now, Ostoja's general culture before he immigrated, obviously European culture, and what he came out of, and how he would compare to some of the other synesthetic figures that we're more aware of.
Yeah, I mean, he was very much aware of that. He came out of a constructivist mode, trained essentially in Europe, in Poland, Germany, and then moved to Australia,
Right.
where he began as a painter at that point,
Right.
but then was engaged in technology through the mechanisms of Adelaide, realistically.
Right.
Yeah.
The commonalities, I think, are clear through some of the work in the U.S. in terms of the same period and the same interests in synesthetic or performative instrumentation. That's great. In contrast, our next Jelena MARTINOVIC from Geneva gives us a different angle, covering more or less the same several decades, but as opposed to the somewhat formal art engineering, instrumentation types of things that we've seen up till now, she'll be talking about two artists, contrasting two artists, one Downey and Paul Ryan, who both made extensive use of anthropological fieldwork. So another real kind of contrasting source for their production in those years. Any other comments from the floor while the setup on the first two? Questions from the floor? I wonder, this is just a speculation completely off the top of my head, whether U.S. art tech, thinking here of 9 evenings of theater and engineering maybe as a starting point, was specifically less interested in the synesthetic than some of these other movements, like which Ostoja is an example of. And if so, for instance, Cage or Rauschenberg or some of the other really famous 9 evenings people, we're not so concerned with what I mean, I'm not putting the synesthetic Gesamtkunstwerk notion as the dominant, but it is very common, and it's seen everywhere. But maybe 9 evenings didn't have that much of a focus. Anyway, just a speculation. Are we ready, Jelena? Go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for these excellent papers. I actually won't be presenting a case study, what I do usually, but I take this opportunity to explore in a really an explorative manner how one can link multimedia art and fieldwork. So I'm coming rather from history of psychology, and so I'm interested in the overlappings between experimental science, psychology, and multimedia, or the arts in general, in the 60s and 70s. And so I've been recently working in a project at the Geneva University of Art and Design entitled Mind Control, Radical Experiments in Art and Psychology in the 1960s and 70s. And we're, so it's an academic research project, but we are also interested in finding displays and aesthetic propositions out of our research. So one of the results will be a website where we will put on display our documents. So, yeah, let's start immediately. So it's a kind of also this opportunity today for me to take the media art history almost like as a field work for myself coming out of another context. So you will excuse me if I'm really simplifying and explorative. So it has been common to associate the ethnographer with the artist. I mean, with Hal Foster in his famous chapter in Return of the Real, and also Joseph Kosuth was already arguing for the artist as an anthropologist. This vision has been recently challenged very nicely by Julieta Gonzalez, who adds the perspective of multimedia artists who worked in extreme alterity situations such as Juan Downey. So, but I'm not interested to compare, to see whether who is more innovative, the ethnographer or the artist, neither into this art historical discussion, but rather in the field work and the field as such, and what it does to the observer and participant. So as a field of innovation and aesthetic proposition, but also as somewhere where somebody enters and gets out transformed. And so this has been particularly important, as I argue, in the 1960s and 70s, a period marked by the politics of experience. So to quote Lang and a set of different types, we will see experience where the field work actually takes a really experiential and experimental quality. So this is my approach. And I think that also historically and epistemologically speaking, it's interesting to consider fieldwork and multimedia together because of three aspects, I think. One aspect is that observant participation, which is a basic principle of modern anthropology since the beginning of the 20th century, but probably it was already practiced before, implies that the field worker takes part actively into this society he studies, and blurring kind of the borders between the observer and the observed person. And this aspect has been also a practice or a quality practice by the video artists in particular, who were going out into the streets or the forests, recording, sometimes in extreme situations, it's sometimes also in a utopian manner, but they put themselves in an alterity situation. And secondly, the fieldwork and multimedia has become also a place for social or psychological engineering. If you take the case of visual anthropology, and in particular Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead's work on the Balinese, was realized in a period of euphoria for engineering of an anti-authoritarian personality, and therefore the recording device, so audio and in particular film and photography, was thought of being able to provoke a change of perception, social attitudes in the general public, the American public. So Fred Turner has recently made a good observation on this type of innovation or laboratory type. So it's also, it points a little bit out that in some cases it's not really important to say whether it was an artist or an ethnographer or a scientific. It's when it comes to fieldwork and experimentation, these kind of labels are not important. It's different in social life and status, but at least in the practice of knowledge gaining. And the third point would be to consider self-experimentation in a larger historical perspective, taking into account especially the end of the 19th century, in which there was a proliferation of self-explorative and self-experimentation practices among psychologists, alienists, but also physiologists who would go into altitudes in the Alps and take physiological measurements to see what is their effect, or no, to experience what they can think if they have a lack of oxygen. And so even in dangerous and critical situations, they would still produce a knowledge. So there is these three aspects, self-exploration, blurring of observer and observed, and the aspect of social engineering that I keep in back background while exploring this period of the 1960s and 70s. And there's actually a lot of correspondence between 1890 and 1960. We can maybe discuss it later. I've addressed this in another totally different topic. If we have time, we can discuss about it. But so to come to the 1960s, 70s, and multimedia, there has been a lot of good literature written in the last decade, so I won't go into that, but basically what has been emphasized is that the importance in regard of video art, of the accessibility of the portable Sony Portapack, and the types of social feedback, so that there were alternative practices developing in which it was important to produce alternative news or alternative realities, but also multimedia environments in which the spectator becomes part of the performance piece. So this has been also very well described by the observer and participant Jean Youngblood, evidently. But so my approach would be more to consider the video camera as a tool of self-exploration and self-experimentation, and which is then not only the prolongement, I say, like extension of the man in a McLuhanian sense, but rather a tool that enables to come back to one's own mind and other minds. So it's in its experimental and experiential quality that I want to look at it. So I present here just 3 observations that are a bit simplified and a bit lacunary, and they should be completed. But it's just how I move through the material I am interested in, so which is experimental psychotherapy and arts, and which enables me to try to sketch a possible historiography on the 1960s and 70s, which puts emphasis on these interactions. So the first would be that video, the use of video as a weapon, which has been evidently pronounced by several artists, alternative video artists, but it has taken also some very interesting self-explorative and poetic application in some art pieces, like in Juan Downey's The Laughing Alligator. So Juan Downey is a Chilean artist who emigrated first to Paris and then to Washington and New York, and was part of the avant-garde scene in the 60s and 70s, or rather 70s. And so he was spending several months among the Yanomami Indians at the Chilean and Brazilian border, and in which he where actually the living in the community also becomes a source of knowledge to propose a quite interesting and innovative way of talking about architecture. So he was, some historiography exists on his work that links his concept of invisible architecture to the invisible energies, and it's quite an innovative way of talking about global villages and this human machine interaction. But then in one scene in Laughing Alligator, actually he is attacked. He's being attacked by 2 Yanomami Indians, and then he uses his only weapon he has, which is the video camera. It's a kind of a poetic, but still a real coincidence. But otherwise, there is evident. We have heard also in the Wednesday on the presentation on video art and therapy. So there is this common reference or to sorry to the weapon or guerrilla cybernetic strategies, as it was theorized by Paul Ryan, and who is also who is part of this crowd, which is best represented in Guerrilla Television, this book published by Michael Schomburg. And then there are artworks that are literally taking destructive aspects. I don't want to go into these two pieces of Ant Farm, but they are interesting, especially the eternal frame, because there is a reflection on using performance and video art in a real-time measure, where they would also question. So it's a reenactment of the assassination of Kennedy and on the day of 4th of July, and they would there is a speech done by this fake Kennedy on the power of images, and Kennedy being an image by himself, and which is followed by the reenactment, and then afterwards there is a real time investigation on the local population on the effect of this reenactment. But what I think is interesting for me in this perspective is that there is this reference to cybernetic, or there's this theorization of cybernetic guerrilla, but I think there are some little aspects that attained my attention. Is that they, so Paul Ryan, for example, references or theorizes his guerrilla strategy by referencing to Sun Tzu and his treatise on war. So it's an ancient Chinese treatise on strategics and logistics on how to conduct a war. And so it's a voluntary Chinese reference rather than an American reference. And Raindance Corporation, this artist collective, video artist collective in New York, took the name from Rand Corporation. So it's a kind of a direct reaction to the heritage of the psychological warfare, CIA, scientific, political complex of the Cold War. And so there are specific mentions of that type of heritage, and so the reaction of those artists can be read also as a forms of deprogramming the minds, because they inherit of this mental conditioning of the Cold War CIA tradition. So there is something to retain here in this regard. So I move now to video as experience. Very general term. I could choose certainly a better one, but I took it simply in accordance to Ryan and many who believed at that time that with videotape, quotes, that with videotape the performer and the audience can be one and the same, either simultaneously and sequentially. And I will just comment on this one piece, Plato Now, realized by Juan Downey in 1973 at the Everson Museum in Syracuse, which is a live video performance for 9 performers who were trying to reach alpha brainwave. So they had electrodes and were wearing headphones, and they were hearing extracts of Plato's dialogues. So he composed different extracts, kind of introspective reflections, and they were listening to these extracts and had to reach the alpha waves, and they were not visible. So as you see on the left, they were not visible to the public. Only the shadows were visible, as in a Platon cave configuration, and they would be seen through the monitors, which fed back their real-time experience. So there are other very good examples and a lot of use of biofeedback in multimedia, with interesting works done by Alvin Lucier or David Rosenboom. But what I take here out is that there is this voluntary composition of a experimental group in which the out and input of one person modifies also the other, or the composition of a music play, if you look at Rosenboom. And that this has some interesting, how can I say, some simultaneous developments happened within experimental psychotherapy at that time, in which multimedia also has this type of function. So if I take one example out of experimental psychotherapy, there was this couple theory developed in Palo Alto by Edwin Hochhill in 1973, in which he displayed a group therapy setting in which 6 to 8 people would be seated in a circle, and they were really wired to a lot of different cables because physiological measurements were taken out of their arms to see how stressed they were, temperature, etc. And then there were monitors who would film them and feed back the reactions to the others, and they had different devices on the around them, I mean, when they could press on or off in reaction to what another person would say. And then in some cases, some light bulbs would appear in red or white. So it was a whole system thought of, a communication system, which aimed at establishing like a really cybernetic display. He called it also a cybernetic display, in which one reaction really affects the whole dynamic of the group. And what is interesting in this case, which is quite experimental, and I tried to find material, but this person died, and I have only the contact of his widow, and he did not have any materials on that, but he describes it very well in his article. What is interesting in this case is that it was believed that because you can simplify communication through the devices, that for instance, for example, you can also impersonalize reactions. If somebody says like, I shouldn't have done that, and so the group can just react, yeah, go ahead, we don't want to see that, and so you can push a button and influence the course of the conversation. And he thought because you can simplify technically the communication, you would more easily find a solution. But so this is, I won't go deeper into this example, but there is, multimedia takes a specific function there in this cybernetic display. And so I categorize these elements in video as experience, also to give a bit more context of these emergent practices in the 60s and 70s, in which systems theory would take a lot of place in psychotherapy, and in which also fieldwork has an extended signification. In the case of Ronald Lane, the fieldwork or the extreme alterity became really the schizophrenics, and he created this community in which he believed one could heal schizophrenia because one lives in the community. And it goes all with this theory of that schizophrenia is not a mental illness, but rather an illness that is caused by the society. I will make a last comment then at the end, but so I come to a third observation, like acid video, probably a problematic term, but I thought of it just yesterday. I had another video mind in mind. I had video mind in mind because of Paul Ryan, who speaks of video mind and earth mind. And I thought that I was thinking of how you can resume this interaction between human environment and machine, and he makes a really nice theoretical demonstration of what was thought at that time of this interaction. But then I adopted for acid video. I mean, it's also maybe to relate a bit what has been done parallelly in history of architecture, like by Felicity Scott on acid architecture, which considers that the radical architecture and all these expanded mind are a kind of expanded mind versions, but I'm not always sure that it really fits, because it's not the same to imitate an expanded mind, and it's something different to be in a self-explorative process of expanded mind. But still, I think it's a utilitarian, or it's for the moment a working category. It's okay. So, but what I wanted to put into this working category is just that there is this common there is a proliferation of literature, theoretical, subaltern, countercultural on this, on the links between biology, cybernetics, and experiential qualities. So with the and in which is argued that that video, computers, or all types of devices, be this an isolation tank or LSD or a wired display, can actually enhance our capacities to not only perceive a more complex reality, but also to reprogram one's own mind. And so there were this famous publication of the programming and meta-programming by John Lilly, and who was then referred to as the acid programming. That's why I put it also. And okay, I make it short because I think I have another maybe. How many? Right now. Oh, okay, so perfect. So I move on. So what I wanted just to put this acid video in a larger context of biocybernetic perceptions of the self, in which consider the states of consciousness rather in an evolving sense, going from extreme states to the normophrenic, which is like considered the normal state. So it's all these. I make it short because I have to go. I just chosen these two graphics by Roland Fisher, who is an interesting scientist of that time, who was plurally multidisciplinary. Okay, I move on. With a very little short note, I've been reading Robert Wassi's Mind Blower, so this pornographic literature, and there is this one chapter in this novel, so the protagonist is welcomed or goes into a house where there is this Toso guru-like sexual healer, introducer into diverse practices, sometimes criminal, pornographic. And then so he has to go through several steps of self-exploration which aim to transform him completely. So his relation to sexuality, to norms, etc., which goes along with this kind of schemes which aim to blur the borders between the normal and the pathological and extend. And there is one in one chapter. Actually, the peak of all the experiences is when he enters in a room where there is the machine, or actually the machine of experience is a machine of video and tools in which he has to interact to reach really this self-transformation par excellence. There are other things happening. It's video rover and pansexuality. I don't know. It's just really a footnote. But what I want to finish on is that this type of that there is an interesting thing happening between self-explorative, countercultural, cultural positions of liberations of the mind, and what goes along with the human potential movement, Essel and Fritz Perls, all these type of liberating practices of the mind. But this goes along also with ideas of how you can reprogram the mind, whether this be through a machine, like video or multimedia tools. And so there is this concomitant development of these two ideas, deprogramming and reprogramming. And I will stop with Brian De Palma's Hi Mom, just to relate how human potential ideas such as the racial encounter seminars of George Leonard can be suddenly found in this film, which is on voyeurism and surveillance, and in which the disruptive element is shot in black and white with a portable Sony I don't know if it was a Sony portable, but I guess, and it's the only disruptive moment is this very experiential moment, transgressive with a lot of violence, where a group is forced to experience what it is to be black. Okay, thank you for attention, and hope so.
In, I think, 9 minutes, I'd like first to allow the panelists, Jelena, Martyn, Tony, Patrick, to address each other, if you have, or audience at the same moment, think of your questions and comments.
I've got maybe a question for Patrick. The fog sculpture.
Yep.
That artist, sorry, I'm naming off the Japanese artist, she went on to make more fog sculptures. In fact, there's one in Australia, in fact, I think. So what was the deal between her and the engineer for her, her future career as a fog sculpturist?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So their collaboration, which started with the piece that I showed you, continued. The engineer passed away in 1992, and his children took over the company after that, but they've continued the collaboration to this day. So, for example, when the Exploratorium in San Francisco reopened, one of the feature pieces is a fog bridge that Nakaya designed and built, and then Mi Industries provides the hardware for it. Yeah.
I'll check the label on the sculpture back in Australia and see that it's actually...
I'd actually be really interested to see if it's the
I
same.
don't think they do actually,
Yeah.
but I'll double check.
I had a question for Jelena.
Yeah.
The John Lilly acid programming, is
Yeah.
that the same John Lilly with sensory deprivation tanks
Yes,
and
yes,
dolphin
exactly.
communication?
Yeah, because
Wow.
so that was his initial. So he's an experimental scientist, and then he became kind of a more experiential.
To say the least.
Yeah. He published in a book in 1977, The Deep Self. So this is on relaxation methods, which are inspired by, he actually hypothesizes there that the isolation tank can lead to this meditative states. And what is interesting in his case, very eclectic background, but is that even you can read in his, because he illustrates several states of transformation within this isolation tank, and there is even, although he not quotes it, but even a kind of a Jungian transpersonal influence there, because it's like you almost experience quite of a near-death experience in order to become like healed. So it's a very big shift from being first experimental science. It's also really in the construction, and then going into more. But he used also for his isolation tank. I didn't read it in detail, but he used, so he invited a lot of different people to go into the isolation tanks, and there were some writers and artists also, and I want to look at it more in detail, yeah.
Others in the audience? Chris?
Thanks to everybody for a really fantastic panel. I mean, I guess there's more comments to Patrick. So the first one is interesting because what your analysis starts to show to this, I think, to this media art history community is why still technologically driven or techno-scientifically driven art is not accepted by the mainstream art world because of this already confluence between industry and art production in the 1960s. I mean, Burnham, as you show, himself, said, well, this was a failure at the time. Of course, it's very ironic that still continues when the visual art world is more driven by capitalist motives than industry, but that's never really discussed. The second thing is, and I know it's not really your work, but it just struck me that the different kind of epistemes of the Cold War military industrial complex and artists in the 1960s, and no one ever makes the comment that, in fact, all the male visual artists in the LACMA program were working at companies that were anathema to the counterculture, RAND and JPL, but and Michael will know this too, that what I'm curious about is in the 1990s, you had organizations that were not industries like Rockefeller, who had a venture capital wing called Provinex, who invested in certain companies. Netomat was one, by artists, but they were less interested. I mean, they were interested, of course, in the potential issues of patents, but they were interested in forms of organization that might take place, forms of social organization and social innovation. And so that's another interesting puzzle in this game, because it was not directly related to kind of spin-offs from patents, but in fact, what are new kinds of modes in the knowledge economy? So that the move away from the kind of Cold War military economy to the kind of knowledge economy. So it would be interesting to think about what those nonprofits like Ford and Rockefeller from the 1960s to the 1990s played in this as intermediaries. And so, I mean, it is more of a comment, but something we should maybe talk more about. So.
Should I
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just noting that we have about 3 minutes,
yeah.
4 minutes.
Well, maybe we can talk after, because my answer is probably going to go beyond 3 minutes.
I have one for Jelena, but just don't forget, for the audience, and Chris knows, Rockefeller, at the time, the work I did for them, I talked about yesterday, also asked Michael Neymark to develop a model for a sustainable lab, which came out largely around things like IP transfer and patents. Jelena, you talk about the camera, and in terms of your category of experience and acid or psychedelia, my readings so far in the what's published mainly talks about processing, the real-time processing aspect. For example, Gene Youngblood wrote about the Chicago electronic visualization people, and talked about, for them, technology was this electronic tools for processing video was a technology of the self. You didn't. You raise works that don't deal with that processing aspect, but the camera itself. I wonder if you just can reflect on that, or do you have a space for this?
Yeah, I didn't include. I wanted first to include Paul Ryan, who had a lot of reflection on the video as a process, and he was and he wrote also extensively on video in his writings on genealogy of video, and he uses he uses then the concept of the Moebius, of the in and out fold, as a kind of a process where also the video enables kind of to blur these boundaries between the inside and the outside.
Right.
So I think if I include this type of, it's rather this type of reflections that I would use that help me to think more broadly in how psychological theories can be related to video art. So yeah, I didn't tell of...
Oh, I'm just broadening it, but I think what you bring up, especially connecting it to field work and psychoanalysis, is incredible. Other people? Other comments? Last word? Please.
Is it possible to play the first video of the presentation of Australia, maybe?
Okay, so we're going to now move to audiovisual playback, if we can, and if you don't want to stay for that, this is the end of the session.